Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us again on this beautiful Sunday morning for our video service. A couple of things I wanted to mention. The men's meeting is not going to meet this Monday night because it's Martin Luther King Jr. Day, so they're going to take this week off. Our ladies group will meet Thursday at 6:30 on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, let myself or Deanne Parodies know. We'd love to have you join us. This is our missions tithe and offering week. So if you want to give regular tithe and offering or to our missions, you can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button, and give that way. You can mail a check to 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area and you want Pastor Carl or I to come by and pick up your tithe, we'd be happy to do that. And speaking of tithes, we've been raising money for our virtual wall for the sanctuary. We have the virtual wall. It's here, but we haven't paid for all of it yet. So we'd deeply appreciate anything that you can give towards that. We'll start the installation on that probably once this peak in the pandemic kind of mellows out. Everybody make sure they're healthy and safe. So we're looking forward to seeing what that looks like because I think it will change our worship experience. That's really all I have to cover today, so we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl now to teach us a little more on courage.
Well, hello again. Glad to have you guys back, Father's House. It's always good to be here. And friends of the Father's House. Of course, if I say hello, Father's House, that really means anybody that's watching this, because if you're watching it, we consider you a part of the Father's House one way or the other. Anyway, just want to say welcome. Glad you're here again today. And as we now kind of look to get past winter, as winter is, the first day of winter is well past us now, and we're moving towards maybe the heart of winter and then into the spring. I trust that good days are ahead. Concerning the pandemic, it looks like we're kind of at that peak already, and that it should be after the holidays, it should be coming down. So that's a good thing. I know that this time, COVID hit closer to home in many households than it did in the past. And so with that being said, I think we're just, there's a lot of us with extra tension today because of that. Needless to say, we just have to believe that God's got this covered. He's going to take care of it, and that he will. It's nothing that caught him by surprise. Which then kind of brings us to these topics that we're talking about. When we talk about Christian virtues, or virtues from the Christian perspective, I guess we could call it as well. And we've been talking here for the last 3 weeks about the virtue of courage. Today we're going to talk about the virtue of courage, and then next week we're going to move on to another virtue. So if you haven't followed along with what our talk about courage, you might want to go back and look at that. The last 3 weeks that we've talked about by way of video. And you can find them on our Father's House webpage at thefathershouse.org, or you can actually look up my name, or the Father's House San Jose on the YouTube channel, and those videos will pop up and they're dated so you know which dates they are. So anyway, just some thoughts about the last 3 weeks. Really, since Christmas, we've been talking about this idea of courage. And I kind of picked that as the first virtue to talk about because, we talked about 2020 and 2021 both being hard years. And then moving into 2022, there's no guarantee that 2022 is not going to be a hard year either, is there? Just because we go from December 31st to January 1st doesn't mean that everything in life changes like there's a new chapter in a book. That's not the way that life works. So I wanted to bring in a new year talking about courage, the idea of fortitude, of steadfastness, immovability to some extent when facing adversity. This week I want to talk about how do you stand with courage when you know that at the end of it all, may not end well for you. Talked about this all the way through courage, that courage stands in the middle of a crisis or in the middle of an event, not knowing what the outcome is going to be, either good or bad. I think it's easy for us to deceive ourselves to think, well, gosh, if I have courage and if I stand, then everything's going to come out well and I don't have to worry about the end because God's going to take care of it. And in the ultimate sense, that's true. But it doesn't always end, or doesn't always end the way that we want it to end, no matter what the situation is, whether it's big or small. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But I want to talk about and reiterate before we move into this that all of the virtues that we should possess and that we do possess at one level or another are ones, and we really get these virtues by way of practice of lifting our virtues, our virtuous weights. And so we don't learn courage unless we're thrown into circumstances where we need courage. We don't learn patience unless we're thrown into circumstances where we've got to exhibit patience. We'll talk about that a little bit next, maybe even next week when we talk about probably the virtue of temperance, or the next couple of weeks after that when we talk about temperance. But the idea is that these virtues, they just don't come to us naturally, do they? They're things that we've got to learn in life. They start when we're children, and they're things that progress and grow, at least hopefully, as we move into adulthood and into the later years of our life, which becomes kind of the basis and the foundation for wisdom in our life. But today I want to talk about courage, and I want to talk about what does courage look like when it's not going to end well? What is courage going to look like when it's not going to end well? Let me put it maybe another way even. What does fortitude look like when you know at the end of it all it's going to cost you your life? Which might be a little bit of a different way to think about it. So I want to put in juxtaposition two different figures. I want to take Abraham from the Old Testament, and then I want to take a contemporary figure of our day. But I want to start with Abraham, and probably the biggest challenge that he ever faced concerning his faith in God. But we always think about Abraham, and we always think about the faith of Abraham. But what we don't realize that in the faith of Abraham, there was an element of courage, standing with fortitude, immovable in the things that God asked him to do. He didn't waver from those things. And courage is one of those things that causes us not to waver, not just faith, but courage does as well. It's almost like when we go back to the very first when we talked about courage, when Jesus told his disciples when they were in the boat and they were afraid, and he said, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." And then after Peter tried to walk on the water, and then he got back and didn't make it, and they got back in the boat, he asked Peter why he lost his faith, or why did he doubt? Why did he lose his courage? Maybe analogously along with that. So I want to talk a little bit about Abraham and his faith in light of, and almost with this foundation of courage underlying it. You see, Abraham understood that he had to have courage to do the things that God wanted him to do. He had to have fortitude with those things. God didn't tell him to leave the land of the Ur of Chaldees and it was going to immediately something was going to happen for the good. It wasn't going to be for years that he was going to settle in on his own land. And that really ultimately happened really through the whole Exodus event with Moses for the most part. But I mean, in a limited sense, it happened before that, but that's the idea that we're talking about here, is this idea of fortitude, of staying with God when you know God's calling you to do something or putting you into a predicament where you have to do something, and being able to stand in the midst of the most extreme pressure that you might ever face in your life. See, courage is forged in pressure. It's not forged when things are going well. And that's always important to keep in mind, because if we're not in these pressure situations, then we're not really going to grow in the area of courage, fortitude, in the way that we could when we find ourselves in the midst of pressure situations. So let's talk about two people. One of them, the story ends well, and the other, the story didn't end well in the ultimate sense. Well, maybe not in the ultimate sense, but in the temporal ultimate sense, meaning the loss of life. So we're going to pick up in Genesis chapter 22. I'm going to read a short story, and it'll pretty much explain itself. It says, "Now it came about that after these things that God tested Abraham, and he said to him, 'Abraham?' And he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will tell you.' So Abraham rose in the morning saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he split wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and a knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here am I, my son." And he said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. Then they came to the place of which God had told them. Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood, and bound his son Isaac, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here am I." And he said, "Do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him, for I know now that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him, a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him as a burnt offering in the place of his son. That's quite a profound story, isn't it? There's a lot that can be said about that story. There's a lot of people that have criticized that story and why God would require that of Abraham. And we're going to leave most of that lie for maybe a future discussion. But I wanted to talk today about the idea of how is it that you show fortitude when, at least in Abraham's perception here, the idea was it wasn't going to end well, was it? I think that probably the worst thing about that is the idea that when God asked him to sacrifice his own son, Abraham at that time would have probably sacrificed his own life before he would have his own son. He could have had the conversation saying, "God, I don't think it's got to be this way. Matter of fact, why don't you take my life and why don't you let my son live? Let's just do it that way and we'll call it good." I don't know any loving parent that wouldn't exchange places with their child in the situation of a life and death matter. Yet Abraham also knew that what it is that God wanted him to do was extraordinary. It was above and beyond maybe what he even understood at the time. So with that, trusting in God, he took his son, and you can imagine the journey. I mean, imagine traveling 3 days with your son, knowing that you're going to sacrifice your son on an altar to God. What went through Abraham's mind during that time? Do you think there was sorrow? Sure there was. Regret? Do you think there was fear, pain, a sense of pain, a sense of betrayal by God, a sense and a feeling that he was betraying his son? What were all the emotions he felt? I mean, I would just think that he just had to have an angst in him about what was happening, that he didn't want to make the journey. He didn't want to go there. And 3 days was a long time to travel and have this angst in your heart over something that you knew was out of your control. Yet Abraham, in the midst of that, displayed courage. He didn't know what the end was going to be. He believed the end was going to be he was going to have to sacrifice his son to God. Now, he understood the promises God had given him. He understood all of those different kind of things. And he didn't understand what it was that God wanted to do, nor did he really understand what the ultimate plan of God was. All he could do is trust God. But in the midst of this trusting God, he didn't whine. He didn't shrink back. He found the courage and he found the strength to move forward, knowing that the end was probably not going to end well for his son. Now, it wasn't just going to not end well for his son, because his son would have died. It would have ended well for him, Isaac. Abraham would have lost a son. He would have been grieving, and he would have to go back and break the heart of his wife, telling him what he had done to his own son. I think the things that Abraham had to go through are bigger than we think about when we think about it like that. When we read that story, we read it so flat sometimes that we don't realize the emotion that had to be there inside a fire and a flame in Abraham. You almost pick that up in the text, in that whole idea of where he says, here I am, here I am, here I am. First, God's asking him, Abraham, I want you to do something. He says, here I am. And then when him and his son are walking, he's saying, Dad, he says, here, I got a question to ask you. Here I am, I'm here. And then at the end of it all, when he's going ready to slay his son, and the angel says, Abraham, stop. And Abraham says, here I am. It's almost as in this eagerness of that, in that here I am, you catch the fact that he's listening very closely and hoping the results will be different than he thinks. But by the idea of him saying, here I am, here I am, here I am, it just speaks of the idea of the presence, of his understanding of what God was requiring of him, and his astute awareness of what it meant. In the case of this story, as we just read, it ended up well. It ended up, in this case, that Abraham, in his fortitude, saw a victory that he couldn't see any other way. It was something that God put him through, as the text says. But at the end of the day, in passing the test, it ended well for his son and for him and for his mother. But that's not always the case when it comes to courage, is it? There's sometimes that courage costs us something even more than that. Costs us our very lives. We've talked in the last couple of weeks about people that died as martyrs, and they stood in a courageous position. I want to talk about, and what we've talked about the last couple of weeks, we've talked about people from maybe a remote past, other than we talked about Edith Stein, who would be recent, but we talked of Joan of Arc before her. But this week, I want to talk about somebody that's near and dear to the American heart as an American martyr, and especially because tomorrow we'll be celebrating his holiday, and that would be Martin Luther King Jr. And Martin Luther King Jr. was a man that was a man of God, and I don't think I need to say much about who he was. Great civil rights leader, and basically in the midst of his situation, his life didn't end well because he was assassinated. So we can look at the story of Martin Luther King being assassinated, but rather than looking at that which didn't end well for him on a temporal sense, his physical sense, but I want to go back to something that happened years before in an encounter that he had with God. When the bus strikes were going on in Montgomery at the beginning, that as they were going on, that Martin Luther King Jr. would receive many, many death threats, sometimes up to 30, 40, or 50 a day. One morning when his wife was in bed with the children, the child, I don't know if the child or children at the time, I think child. And while they were in bed, he received a phone call in the late night, and a man told him that he better get out of town. Him and his family, called him a racial slur, or said that the house would be bombed within 3 days. Well, he had heard many death threats. For some reason, this one really grabbed him. Not being able to sleep that night, he made himself a cup of coffee. And when he made himself a cup of coffee, he sat down at his kitchen table, and he just, in the pressure of the moment, knowing that his life had been threatened over and over and over again, for some reason, this one got him. He got the reality of what it is that God was asking him to do. He sat down and he began to pray. As he began to pray, he says, God, I don't know if I can go through this. I'm afraid. I'm unsure. All those different doubts that he had. And he laid out his heart before God in the midst of his fear that the whole situation may not end well. All he wanted to do was be a pastor of a church. He didn't want to be the leader of a civil rights movement, but God wanted him to be. In that exchange in that kitchen that one night, he said he felt this overwhelming presence of God that was there. And the voice was telling him, Martin, every time you stand up for righteousness and justice and for the right thing, I will be right beside you every single time. What Martin Luther King said after that exchange with God and that divine presence was there in the kitchen was that he never feared again. He never feared for his life or the outcome of his family. It would be years later that the ultimate price would be paid. Ironically, when he received that death threat, 3 days later there was a bomb thrown outside of his house. Luckily, his wife, a friend, and his family members, were unharmed. In the midst of that bomb going off, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said there was a calmness about him because of that encounter in that kitchen that day. You see, when he knew that what he was doing was ordained of God, when he knew that God was with him, when he knew probably even at that point that the chances of him dying would be great and that he might die, he could have chosen to back out. He could have chosen to say, I'm not going to walk this path with you, God. I'm not going to go through this. I'm not going to be the price. You can't make me do this. Or he could simply say, I understand you'll be with me. I don't know what the outcome will be, but I know you'll be with me through it all. The ironic thing between these two men is it ended well for Abraham and his son. At the end of the day, it didn't end well for Martin Luther King Jr. in that one night a gunman took his life. The interesting thing about the Martin Luther King story was the night before he was killed, the last speech that he gave was his great speech where I've been to the mountaintop. I may not get there with you, but we're going to get there. In other words, he knew that day he was going to pass. He knew that day he was going to die. And there was something about that where he knew that even in his death, he was going to stand with fortitude, knowing that his time on earth was done. That's a great example of what courage is. In both cases, it doesn't matter what the outcome is. It matters how we stand in the midst of it. It matters as Christians how we stand in the midst of pressure. When pressure comes against us and we're caught by fear, we're caught by uncertainty, doubt, all things that we will naturally feel and are a part of how God created us to feel. The biggest part of that is overcoming that in the attitude and the mind and the virtue of courage or fortitude. That when the winds and rains come, when the enemy is roaring at you like a lion, when it's trying to cause you to be paralyzed with fear, to simply not give in, but to say, I'm afraid, but I'm going to stand. I'm afraid, but I'm going to trust God. I'm afraid, but I know God. And when we can do that as Christians, we find that we're not moved by much. We're not moved by things that happen politically. We're not moved by health concerns in the same way. We're not moved by financial disaster or financial ruin. We're not moved by, in our spirit, things that happen in the natural world of our weather or world events. You see, the value and the virtue of courage helps us move beyond that. It causes us to transcend our circumstance, to look at God and to stand in this strength that we can only get. We can trust in God, and we know and can trust that He has our best interest in mind. The only way you can grow it is to stand. The only way that you can experience it is to go through extreme pressure. The question is, will you? Will you stand and go through it? If you will, you'll find God with you every step of the way. If you back off, what you're going to find is not that the presence of God wasn't with you or wouldn't be with you, or that even withdrawal from you, but you're going to find you missed this miracle opportunity to watch God do something great in the midst of a great storm. Like Jesus said to his disciples when we started this whole idea of courage with the fishermen in the boat on a sea, out of complete control. Jesus walking on the water, wanting to walk right by them seeing him and believing he was a ghost, crying out in fear, and Jesus says, take courage. Do not be afraid. It is I. Today we got a decision to make. You've got a decision, like I've got a decision, to choose whether we're going to walk in fear or stand in courage. Today I hope that you'll stand in courage. No matter what comes your way, or when pressure comes in the future, that you'll remember this message about courage and choose to stand, knowing that God's with you when you stand for what is right. I don't think I have much more to say about courage. I mean, we could talk about it for more weeks. We can give examples of that, and we've given many examples of the way that courage works. What I'm hoping is that you've learned the value of this virtue and see how it's a foundation stone on how a Christian ought to be, the very character fabric of what ought to be in us. And when it's there, it's residing in us, no man can take it away from you. No storm can come against it. It can stand it all because it's built into you by the Spirit of God. God bless you. I hope that today you'll take some time to think about courage and knowing that the very situation that you might be in today or in the future is an opportunity for you to strengthen yourself in the virtue of courage. God bless you and have a great day.